He boarded quietly, no fanfare, no bodyguards, no designer luggage, just a seat. 2A, first class, paid in full. But when Malcolm Greer, a calm and soft-spoken black CEO, reached his seat, he found a folded note taped to the headrest. Out of service. No explanation, no apology. Just eyes watching to see if he'd move. So here's the question. What happens when a man built on quiet strength decides not to move? What happens when his stillness speaks louder than protest, and more importantly, what if that one silent refusal unlocks a reckoning across an entire airline industry? This story isn't just about a seat, it's about dignity, invisibility, and the quiet courage it takes to stay seated when the world wants you to shrink. Get ready for a story of transformation, truth, and one man's refusal to disappear. If this story moves you even a little, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter. Now, let's begin. The morning light at Denver International shimmered against the aircraft windows, casting long, blurred reflections on the polished floor. Gate B42 was already busy, with soft jazz leaking from overhead speakers and the low thrum of business calls drifting between shoulders clad in designer blazers. Malcolm Greer stood near the window, quietly watching Flight 2271 prepare for boarding. He didn't like airports, not because of the chaos or the crowds, but because of how they made people show their hierarchy without ever needing to speak. It was always in the way gate agents smiled longer at certain passengers, the way eyes briefly scanned him before offering assistance, as if they were measuring something. Malcolm wasn't dressed like a CEO. No designer suit, no monogrammed luggage, no gold-plated headphones, just a navy blue crew neck, comfortable charcoal trousers, and a worn leather laptop bag. Unbranded. Intentional. He preferred to walk into rooms quietly, make people guess. Boarding was announced. First-class passengers were called Zone 1, now boarding. He approached the gate calmly. The agent, a young man with slick hair and a corporate name tag, did a small double-take before forcing a smile. "Morning. Sir, just need to scan that real quick." Malcolm offered his boarding pass without comment. The scanner beeped. He walked through, nodding politely. On board, he took a few seconds to absorb the familiar atmosphere of first class. Neutral-toned leather seats, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the soft click of overhead bins. There was something sterile yet luxurious about it all, like a perfectly staged photograph of comfort. His seat was 2A, window, his favorite. He placed his bag beneath the seat, sat down slowly, and let his fingers trace the stitching of the armrest. Across the aisle, a woman in a crisp red coat glanced at him, then away, then looked again, this time a little longer. He could already feel the question forming in her mind. Do you belong here? It wasn't the first time someone had asked without words, and it wouldn't be the last. A flight attendant passed by, checking compartments and smiling as she moved. Her name tag read Riley Monroe. She paused just long enough to give Malcolm a brief, honest nod. Not overly warm, not dismissive, just real. He appreciated that more than he could say. Outside the window, the jet bridge groaned as it pulled away. A flurry of luggage carts rushed beneath. A child in economy sneezed loudly. Somewhere in the back rows, someone coughed 4 times, each more irritated than the last. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly. He was heading to Baltimore for the Global Infrastructure Integrity Summit, a closed-door event, just 30 leaders worldwide. Quiet power, the kind that preferred handshakes in lounges over hashtags online. His company, Greer Core Systems, had recently deployed a sweeping new aviation encryption standard known as RavenNet. Most of the public had no idea what it was, but nearly every major airline in North America now relied on it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had helped design the very digital veins that made this aircraft safe, efficient, and timely. And yet, seated quietly in 2A, he was still just another black man whose presence unsettled people in tailored clothing. The woman across from him, Genevieve Locke, though he didn't know that yet, cleared her throat and pulled a compact mirror from her purse. She angled it deliberately, catching a glimpse of Malcolm behind her shoulder. She didn't hide it well. Then she pressed the call button. Riley returned quickly, crouching politely. Yes. Ma'am Genevieve spoke in hushed tones. Her eyes flicked toward Malcolm more than once. He caught snatches. Just checking. This section. Didn't see the usual. Riley's eyes stiffened for a brief moment, then returned to calm professionalism. Of course, I'll double-check for you. Malcolm didn't react. He stared out the window at the blur of machinery on the tarmac. His reflection hovered faintly against the glass. Strong jawline, trim beard, deep eyes that held a weariness no suit could hide. Minutes passed. Then another figure approached. Not Riley this time. A different attendant, older, more senior, with the kind of forced cheerfulness Malcolm had seen too many times before. "Good morning, sir," she began, standing slightly sideways. "I'm terribly sorry, but it seems there's been a minor issue flagged with your seat." "A technical thing. We'll need to reseat you just temporarily. Shouldn't take long." Malcolm blinked slowly. "What sort of issue?" "Oh, nothing mechanical," she said quickly. "Just internal maintenance flagged a note here. Sometimes these things are overlooked during boarding." She reached over and pointed delicately. On the seat console, where the control buttons were, a small yellow post-it note had been stuck. 3 words written in uneven capital letters: "Out of service." Malcolm didn't speak for a moment. He looked at the note, then at her, then back at the note. No barcode, no official airline tag, no maintenance tape, just a regular sticky note. From someone's desk, someone's pocket. His jaw flexed. "I see," he said quietly. "Again, it's just temporary," she added quickly. "We'll seat you toward the rear until we resolve." Malcolm raised one hand gently. Not a protest, just stillness. He stood, slipped his phone from his pocket, walked slowly toward the galley. The woman didn't follow. In the galley, he leaned against the wall, dialed a number with one hand. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but unwavering. "Andre, it's me. Go dark on Sector Echo. Now." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Copy that." The call ended. Malcolm looked out past the galley curtain toward the cabin. The system had been triggered. Malcolm stepped back into the aisle with the same calm he had entered the plane with. But something behind his eyes had shifted. The slow burn had started, not the type that ignites quickly and explodes, but the quiet kind, steady, deliberate, waiting for air. Passengers were still settling in. A few glanced at him, curious, some indifferent. Genevieve Locke had returned to scrolling through her phone. She wore entitlement like it was perfume-layered, expensive, and invisible unless you knew what it smelled like. Riley Monroe noticed him returning from the galley. Her brows furrowed slightly. She'd been working flights long enough to sense when something wasn't right, even when no one said a word. That's what most passengers never understood. Flight attendants read 1,000 emotions per hour. They could tell the difference between a nervous flyer and a man pushed to the edge. She stepped into his path gently. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm not sure what's going on, but I didn't place that note, and I don't believe there's anything actually wrong with your seat." Malcolm looked at her for a long second. "I believe you," he replied. That was all he said. No anger, No accusation, just trust, handed softly between strangers. She hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. As he neared 2A, the older attendant from earlier appeared again, this time accompanied by the lead purser, a man in his mid-50s with silver temples and a clipboard tucked under one arm. "I'm afraid we're going to ask you to remain in the forward galley, sir," the purser said. "Captain's orders until maintenance confirms the seat is cleared." Malcolm didn't move. "Has maintenance been called?" The purser hesitated. "It's being handled." "You mean it hasn't?" The silence between them thickened. Riley stood a few feet away, watching. So did a few passengers in the business class rows behind the curtain. People sense when tension is no longer private. He took a slow breath. Then he sat back down in 2A. The older attendant leaned in. "Sir, we've asked you to—" "I heard you," Malcolm said softly. "And I've decided not to yield my seat for an unverified technical concern reported by a sticky note." The purser's posture shifted. This was unexpected. He looked toward the cockpit, unsure. "Sir, if you don't comply, we may be forced to delay. It's already delayed," Malcolm said, still calm. "In fact, the entire digital control system for Sector Echo has been paused. I expect gate operations to be unresponsive in 90 seconds. The purser blinked. "I'm sorry," I said, Malcolm repeated gently. "That nothing will move, no updates, no baggage sync, no rerouting until this aircraft and every person on it are accounted for, transparently and truthfully." That was when the first ping hit the cabin intercom. This is Captain Keller," came the voice from overhead, a practiced tone with just a thread of confusion underneath. "We're currently experiencing an unexpected delay in pre-takeoff system sync. Should be temporary. We appreciate your patience." Malcolm's phone vibrated once. A single notification flashed across the screen. "Revenet Sector Echo Lock engaged. Gate opes unresponsive. EST reset undefined." He closed the phone and tucked it away. Across the aisle, Genevieve had noticed the disturbance now. She watched him with thinly veiled curiosity. Her lips pursed. Something about the lack of escalation confused her. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening. He was just sitting, unbothered, unmoved, uncooperative in the quietest way possible. A different kind of power. Captain Jordan Keller stepped out of the cockpit moments later, walking back to first class with his brow furrowed. "What's going on up here?" he asked the purser, lowering his voice. The purser leaned in and whispered. The captain's eyes followed his glance toward Malcolm, then flicked toward the sticky note still attached to the console. He picked it up, held it between two fingers like a foreign object. This came from maintenance. No one answered. Malcolm met his eyes. "I don't think your system flagged that, Captain." Keller looked at him again, slower this time. "Measuring, the way pilots did before they hit turbulence." "Who are you, exactly?" Keller asked. "Passenger 2A, Malcolm replied. "Nothing more." Keller folded his arms. "Yet you claim to have shut down a portion of our systems." "I didn't claim, I confirmed." The silence that followed was deep and slightly unnerving. The kind that suggested the people around him were realizing he wasn't bluffing. "Do you have any idea what kind of chaos that could cause?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "I built it." It took Keller a moment to understand. Then it clicked. "Malcolm Greer," he said slowly. Behind him, Riley Monroe stiffened. Even Genevieve blinked. Malcolm nodded once. The captain exhaled and sat down in 2B without being invited. The two men were now inches apart, one in uniform, the other in civilian quiet. The kind of conversation that happens when reputations speak louder than voices. "You're really the one behind Ravenet?" Keller asked. "Yes. You realize this puts our entire rotation into backlog. Every airport sync to Echo is going to—" "I know," Malcolm said. "I don't do this lightly." Keller leaned back. "What do you want?" Malcolm looked toward Riley. "I want her to tell you what happened. Honestly, without fear." Keller turned toward the flight attendant. "Riley." She hesitated, eyes flicking between the captain and the purser. Riley had flown over 200 routes. She had seen things brushed under the rug. She had also seen colleagues punished for telling the truth. But something in Malcolm's voice, his stillness, his refusal to escalate, gave her a strange sense of protection. She spoke. "I was attending to the pre-check when Mrs. Locke expressed concern about the seating. She seemed surprised by Mr. Greer's presence. She didn't say it out loud, but it was clear she wanted him removed. I never called maintenance. I never flagged the seat." She looked down. I didn't stop it either. The captain was silent. He stood and turned toward Genevieve. "Ma'am, did you speak with my staff regarding this seat?" Genevieve tilted her chin. "I simply inquired." "That's all?" Keller held up the sticky note. "Did you write this?" Genevieve's lips parted. "Excuse me, it's not official. No maintenance tag, no service flag, just a post-it. So I'll ask again, did you put this here?" She looked around, realizing now that the entire front cabin was watching. Her voice grew sharp. "This is outrageous. I demand you focus on the flight instead of interrogating passengers." Keller didn't respond. He walked back to the cockpit, whispering into the intercom. Seconds later, the plane's lights dimmed. The engine hum fell quiet. Power cycle complete. The plane wasn't going anywhere. Not until someone answered for the note. Not until truth reclaimed its seat. The air inside the cabin changed. Not in temperature, not even in pressure, but in presence. The kind of shift that happens when everyone realizes something isn't routine anymore. When passengers lower their magazines, take out their earbuds, and start paying attention for reasons they don't yet understand. Captain Keller hadn't yet returned from the cockpit. Riley Monroe stood motionless, back pressed gently against the bulkhead wall. The purser busied himself with meaningless notes on his tablet, pretending not to notice that the entire flight had quietly stalled around a man who was simply sitting in his assigned seat. Malcolm Greer had not raised his voice. He had not made threats. But somehow, with just one call and a refusal to move, he had grounded a $320 million aircraft and frozen an entire quadrant of airport operations. Genevieve Locke was no longer scrolling through her phone. Her eyes were now fixed on Malcolm, not with curiosity anymore, but with something far more personal. Discomfort. Riley took a breath and walked back to his row. She leaned forward just slightly. "They're calling someone from corporate. I think the ground manager is coming." Malcolm nodded. "Good." She hesitated. "You could have just walked off, you know." "I could have," he said softly, "but you didn't." He looked at her, not unkindly. "Because if I do, the next person won't be me. They won't have a digital kill switch in their pocket. They'll get removed, and then buried in silence." Riley's throat tightened. She had heard stories, quiet removals. Security called for unruly passengers when all someone had done was refuse to switch seats, usually people of color. Always with a vague reason attached: non-compliance, attitude, tone, none of which could be proven, all of which could be believed. She looked over her shoulder, then leaned closer. "My first year, I watched a woman get escorted off in tears. They said she threatened the crew. She hadn't said a word, just refused to give up her seat for a pilot who was deadheading. The man they gave her seat to apologized. Even he knew it was wrong, but she was gone before anyone could speak up. Malcolm didn't blink, and they made sure no one said a word. Yes." The curtain to first class rustled. In stepped a tall, sharply dressed woman in her late 40s. Her posture was exact, her steps even. Her name tag read Marla Dane. Her blazer carried the emblem of Stellar Atlantic Airlines HQ, Senior Operations. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Greer," she began with practiced calm. "I'm Marla Dane, Director of Flight Compliance. May I speak with you in the galley?" Malcolm stood, silently following her. Riley moved to step in, but Malcolm gave a soft shake of his head. He would go alone. Inside the forward galley, Marla kept her hands folded in front of her. Her smile was tight, but hollow. "I want to begin by saying Stellar Atlantic takes incidents of discomfort seriously. We understand something may have been said or done that made you feel." He raised a hand gently. "Stop, please." She blinked. "No scripted apologies." He said, "No vague references to discomfort or unfortunate misunderstandings. You've had 6 minutes to review the camera feed. You know exactly what was done. You're just hoping I walk away quietly." Her throat moved once as she swallowed. Malcolm continued, "That note was not from maintenance. It was not protocol. It was placed by a passenger who was made uncomfortable by my existence. That's not a system error. That's a cultural one." Marla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her blazer and produced a slim silver tablet. She tapped a few times, rotated it, and showed him the screen. A paused still frame. Genevieve Locke, glancing both ways before leaning into the aisle. Her hand reached forward. The yellow post-it, unmistakable, pressed onto the console of seat 2A. Time-stamped. Documented. Marla said nothing. She didn't have to. "I'll be sending that video to myself," Malcolm said. "Under FAA Statute 121-585, that footage is now material to a discrimination review. Your airline is federally required to retain and release it." Her expression flickered. "I could offer you a full refund. Of course, we'll upgrade you on a future flight, and I'd be happy to issue a statement from our team." He cut her off again. "I don't want your refund. Then what do you want? Mr. Greer." He leaned in slightly. "I want you to explain in writing how a woman was allowed to manipulate your cabin staff into silently removing a passenger. I want you to explain why no one challenged her. I want your internal crew report filed under discriminatory interference and submitted to DOT oversight." Marla stiffened. "You know that kind of report flags our quarterly performance." "Exactly." Silence stretched again. Then he added, gently this time, "If you won't protect your passengers, I will protect your record. Publicly." Marla nodded, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. She wasn't speaking to a man making threats. She was speaking to a man who knew how systems worked because he helped build them. Malcolm turned to leave the galley. "Oh," he added as he paused at the curtain. "You should also know I've just forwarded that clip to 2 of your board members. They're both attending the summit in Baltimore. Thought they might want to see what kind of airline they're investing in." He returned to seat 2A and sat down. No one spoke. Not Genevieve, not the purser, not the man 3 rows back with a corporate lanyard. Riley walked past slowly and whispered, "That was something." He looked up at her, eyes clear. "It's not about a seat," he said. "It never was." Outside, ground crew scrambled to figure out why nothing was sinking. Ravenet's lock hadn't been lifted yet, and without Malcolm's private code, the entire cluster of gates would remain digitally paralyzed. Inside, the tension began to shift. Passengers murmured. A few whispered about Malcolm. Someone had recognized his name. Others Googled quietly on their phones. Riley caught one screen, Malcolm Greer net worth. He chuckled softly. Because they always looked for a number. As if the more zeros behind your name, the more your humanity finally made sense to them. 10 minutes later, the lights flickered back to full. Cabin control systems reset. A voice came overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received clearance to proceed with final systems check. We appreciate your patience." The plane began to hum again. Engines cycling. Pre-check resuming. Malcolm never moved. He had not been upgraded. He had not been escorted off. He had not been erased. And that, in a world like this, was a victory far louder than shouting ever could be. The plane was in motion now, slowly taxiing from the gate, the runway lights blinking like a soft heartbeat outside the window. Still, it didn't feel like anything had truly moved. Not for Malcolm. He sat in 2A again, arms resting calmly, though a war churned quietly beneath the surface of his skin. Every breath he took was measured. Every glance down the aisle was calculated, not to appear defensive, but to remain undeniably present. Genevieve Locke hadn't said a word since Marla Dane left the aircraft. She sat rigidly upright, her expensive handbag tucked under one elbow like a personal shield. Her eyes flicked toward him only once every few minutes, usually when she thought no one was looking. But someone always was. Across the aisle, Riley Monroe checked overhead compartments for a third time. Unnecessary, but a way to keep moving. She didn't like the stillness that had taken over the cabin. It felt too full, too electric, too uncertain. She had seen things escalate on planes before: verbal arguments, tantrums, even outright refusal to fly, but never had she seen stillness cause so much disarray. Malcolm was a man sitting in his rightful seat. That was all. And somehow that had nearly grounded the airline. The captain's voice returned, warm but cautious. "This is your captain speaking. We're about 10th in line for departure. Estimated time in air will be 2 hours and 22 minutes. Weather over Baltimore looks clear. Flight crew will be coming through with final checks." There was a pause. Then, as if added under pressure, the captain continued, "We want to thank all passengers for their professionalism and understanding during the delay. We are committed to providing a safe and respectful travel experience." Malcolm heard it. So did everyone else. That word, respectful, it was carefully placed, as if to suggest that what happened had been about mutual misunderstanding. But no one had misunderstood anything. The post-it note had been clear, the intent behind it clearer. He took a breath and shifted his posture slightly. Then he reached into the side of his bag and retrieved a small black leather notebook. Unmarked. He opened to a blank page and began to write. He wasn't writing notes on the flight. He was writing his speech for Baltimore. The one he hadn't even planned to give until this morning. He would title it The Invisible Gate. And he would begin with a question. What happens when the most advanced systems on Earth still fail to detect the simplest injustice? Riley passed again, this time carrying a tray of drinks. When she reached him, her voice softened. "Would you like water?" "Or something else. Water is fine," he said. She leaned closer, under her breath. "They're not just watching anymore. Someone's filming from row 7. I saw the red light." Malcolm didn't look up. "Let them." He didn't say it out loud, but she read it in his expression. "You're sure you're safe?" That made him pause. He looked up, surprised by the honesty in her voice. The concern wasn't professional. It was personal. "I'm not worried about safety," he said. "I'm worried about precedent." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "They'll say this was about a technical glitch. They'll say I overreacted, that I was confrontational. But what they won't say is that every system in this plane is built to serve a hierarchy that can't be spoken out loud. I didn't cause a malfunction. I exposed it." For a moment, Riley forgot she was on duty. Her training said to nod and move on, but she just stood there, listening. "I used to want to be invisible on planes," she said. "Especially in uniform, blend in, keep the passengers calm, make everyone comfortable, even if it meant hiding myself. And now I want people to notice what makes them uncomfortable and ask why." She gave him a quiet smile, then moved down the aisle. At row 7, a young man wearing a gray hoodie continued holding up his phone. He had the angle just right to frame both Malcolm and Genevieve in the same shot. Malcolm noticed the glint of the lens, but didn't flinch. Back in seat 2B, Genevieve finally spoke. "Is this really necessary?" she muttered. Malcolm turned his head slightly. "Excuse me. You got what you wanted. You're still here. You've made your point, so why continue?" He studied her for a moment, not with contempt, but with curiosity. It was clear she hadn't expected him to engage. She had expected silence or sarcasm, but not interest. "What point do you think I was trying to make?" She blinked. "That you belong here. That you won't be moved. That you can push buttons literally and everything shuts down." He nodded slowly. "But I never had to push buttons. Ms. Locke, I simply refused to be erased." She looked away. "Do you know how many times I've sat in this seat?" he asked gently. "How many times I've boarded quietly, greeted the staff, folded my coat, and sat down without incident?" She said nothing. 92. I've flown this airline 92 times in 5 years. First class, corporate travel. Never once missed a payment. Never once caused a disruption. And today, for the first time, I'm treated like a security risk. Why, Genevieve's voice was brittle. "Maybe you're overthinking it." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'm just no longer willing to think quietly about things that hurt loudly." She said nothing more. Malcolm turned his attention back to the notebook, pen in hand. He had always believed in infrastructure, in quiet systems doing their job, but infrastructure was never neutral. The people who designed it decided who it served. The people who enforced it decided who it excluded. He wrote again, "There is no such thing as a silent injustice. There is only a society trained not to listen." The plane began its final approach to the runway. Passengers leaned back. Seat belts clicked. The young man in the hoodie still recorded. The engine surged forward as the aircraft lifted off, cutting through early dusk and clouds. Malcolm's thoughts soared ahead of it. He wasn't just going to Baltimore. He was heading into the heart of a system that thought it could discard people quietly. And this time, it had chosen the wrong man. 25 minutes into the flight, cruising at 36,000 feet. The hum of the engines faded into a quiet lull, but no one on board was truly at ease. The cabin lights dimmed slightly for the dinner service. Trays clinked. A few people accepted wine. Some stared blankly out the window. Others scrolled endlessly, searching for updates on a situation that was already starting to outgrow the narrow fuselage of stellar Atlantic Flight 2087. Malcolm Greer was still seated in 2A. He had not spoken in 15 minutes, not out of retreat, but out of precision. There were times to speak and times to listen. And right now, he was listening to the silence around him, measuring it, studying how people shifted, whispered, chose their words. Even silence has language. His notebook was open across his lap, pen resting neatly beside it. The page read, "If your humanity can be questioned by a note, what protects you when there's no note at all across the aisle?" Riley Monroe moved gently through the row, offering coffee to an elderly couple and whispering something reassuring to a nervous young woman in 3C who hadn't stopped fidgeting since takeoff. When Riley reached Malcolm again, she offered him a warm glance. "Still doing okay?" He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked quietly, How much do you think people really saw? She considered it enough to talk, not enough to act. That's usually how it goes. Malcolm looked toward the back of the cabin. The man in the hoodie from row 7 had stopped filming, but only because his battery had run low. Malcolm had seen him check his screen anxiously, then plug into the seat outlet. The quiet wariness on his face had said enough. He was young, maybe 22, the kind of age where conviction burns strong, but fear of authority still shadows every movement. Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a small white business card. On the back, he wrote, "Whatever they try to spin, truth matters. Document everything." Then he handed it to Riley. "Slip that to the guy in 7C when you pass through again, will you?" She nodded. "He's been watching you like a witness," she added. "No," Malcolm said. "He's watching me like a mirror." Meanwhile, Genevieve Locke had remained unusually quiet, but her fingers were busy, typing quickly on her phone. She wasn't just messaging friends, she was composing something. A formal post. Malcolm had seen the type before. The phrasing was always strategic. "Earlier today, I was on board a flight that encountered an unfortunate incident involving passenger conflict and safety concerns." He could already guess the next few lines. "I believe in respectful communication. I only asked a question. The situation escalated beyond what anyone wanted. It would be polished, ambiguous, and entirely devoid of truth, but social media would devour it. That was the game. The first version people saw often became the version they believed." Riley returned a few minutes later. He read the card. She whispered, nodded once, didn't say anything. "That's enough." Malcolm folded his arms. The stillness in his shoulders could have been mistaken for calm, but inside, his thoughts were racing. He wasn't just thinking about the woman beside him. He was thinking about what would happen when this story landed before they did. Malcolm had lived through media storms before. As the CEO of Greer Core Systems, he had weathered scrutiny, sabotage, even scandal. But those had always been professional storms. Public, yes, but predictable. This wasn't. This was personal. He reached again into his bag and pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones, not to block out sound, but to close off the world for a few moments. Then he closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he wasn't on a plane anymore. He was 12 years old again, on a city bus in Minneapolis, sitting in the front row next to his mother. A white woman stepped on, saw them, and asked the driver to request they move, said the seats were meant for seniors, but Malcolm remembered the space was empty. His mother had looked up and said nothing. She simply stood. They moved to the back. He had asked her why they didn't stay, why they didn't speak up, and she had looked down and whispered something that burned itself into his memory. Because not everyone gets to speak and be believed. When Malcolm opened his eyes, the cabin looked the same, but something inside him had changed. He removed the headphones and sat forward. He opened his notebook again. This time, he wasn't writing for a speech. He was writing something else, a public statement, the kind that wouldn't need edits, wouldn't need spin, just the plain, unfiltered truth. He titled it, "Why I Didn't Move from Seat 2. He wrote for several minutes in silence, lines coming to him like oxygen. "I didn't stay because I wanted attention. I stayed because the alternative was erasure. I stayed because a woman with more comfort than courage decided my presence was offensive. I stayed because a system meant to protect all passengers was used to protect privilege. I stayed because I've walked off too many times before. And I'm done walking." He paused, then added one more line. "And because my seat was not the issue. Your silence was—" He looked up. The cabin was quiet again. Riley had returned to the front galley. Genevieve was still typing, but from somewhere near the rear of the plane, Malcolm heard a soft sound, a ping, then another. Phones. A link had started circulating. A Reddit thread titled, "CEO Gets Discriminated on My Flight. Then brings the whole airline to a standstill" underneath. The first post read, "I was there. It was the calmest takedown I've ever seen." He never raised his voice, but no one could look away. More pings. The first TikTok clip had hit nearly 12,000 views, and growing. Malcolm didn't smile, but his jaw relaxed slightly. He had never asked to be the center of a story, but he would make sure the story served someone other than the system. Beside him, Genevieve's phone pinged. She glanced down, then flushed. Her hand reached for the shade, lowering it to block the view outside, as if that would make her invisible. Malcolm looked out his own window. The sky beyond was wide, clear, open. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was room for truth to fly. Riley Monroe stood at the front of the cabin just outside the galley, one hand lightly braced against the curtain rail. She wasn't pretending to do anything now. No tray, no checklist, just watching. Her eyes traveled down the aisle toward 2A, where Malcolm Greer sat, steady and unmoved. His posture had barely changed since boarding, yet it was as if the gravity in the cabin had shifted entirely around him. Not louder, just heavier, truer. She looked down at her tablet. Notifications had begun to slip through the airline's restricted onboard network. Her own screen was blinking now. Messages, alerts, pings from a flight operations app she had never used before, and a single new text from a number not saved in her contacts. Riley. Step away from the situation. Do not engage further. Final reminder. She swallowed hard. Corporate was watching too, but her feet didn't move. She thought back to her second year with Stellar Atlantic, a long-haul flight to Madrid. A black couple in business class had been bumped to economy for weight redistribution. The reason was technical. At least that was what they said. But Riley had seen the numbers, and she remembered the husband's face when his wife tried to hide tears behind her sunglasses. She hadn't said anything then. She remembered going home and crying in the shower, ashamed of her silence, told herself it was just her job, told herself she was keeping peace, but peace without dignity wasn't peace at all. Now, years later, she stood in a cabin charged with the quiet power of someone who had chosen not to be moved, and she wasn't sure who she was more ashamed of, the company she worked for, or the person she had trained herself to be within it. A chime overhead signaled the start of meal service. She turned back to the cart. Her fingers shook for half a second before she steadied them and began to move. Rows 1 and 2 first. When she reached Malcolm, she paused, unsure whether to offer the standard menu or simply give him a moment. "I'm good, thank you," he said gently, before she could ask. "Just coffee, if possible." She nodded. "Anything for you?" "Ms. Locke Genevieve didn't respond at first. She had her phone in hand, a faint look of dread on her face. Her social feed had finally caught up with the flight number. Someone had tagged her. Her name was circulating. Only one video so far blurry, distant, but the caption said it all. "Rich woman tries to get black CEO kicked out of first class. Doesn't end well." She finally muttered something about water without meeting Riley's eyes. Riley stepped back to the cart, poured the drinks, and returned. As she set the coffee down on Malcolm's tray, their fingers nearly touched. He looked up at her, not with expectation, but something softer. Understanding. "Thank you," she said, even though he hadn't said a word. He simply nodded, then returned his gaze to the notebook in his lap. Behind them, several passengers were whispering now. Not everyone, but enough. Row 4 had started asking questions aloud. A young girl in 5D, maybe high school, was furiously typing into her phone, narrating the events as if she were live tweeting history. 2 hours and 12 minutes left in the air, and already the outside world was circling. Malcolm turned slightly and looked toward the front of the plane. He didn't stand, just leaned into the moment. Let the stillness speak for itself. His phone buzzed once. He glanced down. Unknown contact. One line of text. You're trending. Stay calm. He didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth softened. That meant the story was growing beyond the cabin, reaching people who knew how to move things. A quiet war was being fought with posture, silence, and truth, and he had no intention of retreating. Then, for the first time, his mind wandered, not back to his mother this time, but to his father. Isaac Greer had been a train conductor for 34 years. He wore his uniform like a badge. Every button shined, every crease deliberate, but he was never promoted. No matter how many years passed, there was always a reason, a vague form, a missed opportunity, a mistake no one remembered making. Malcolm remembered one summer evening when he was 12. His father had come home early, shirt stained with something that looked like oil and shame. They told me to wait in the side room while they filled the roster. Then they forgot I was even there. He had said it quietly, like he was describing weather. Malcolm never forgot those words. Forgotten while waiting. It was the most passive kind of violence. To be erased, not with force, but indifference. That memory was the reason he had never built his company in someone else's image. The reason Greer Core Systems had 3 black board members and 2 chairwomen under 40. The reason he had invested in silence-breaking technology, sensors that could detect patterns of bias in employee evaluations and promotions. Because patterns didn't lie. And now, at 36,000 feet, that same invisible pattern had wrapped itself around a flight. But Malcolm wasn't in the side room. He was in 2A. He glanced again at his phone. The battery was now at 38%, but the signal was strong. Then he did something deliberate. He opened the Notes app, selected his statement titled, "Why I Didn't Move from Seat 2A," copied it, and pasted it into an open email draft. To Comms Greer Core. Com subject post. This. He hit send. It was no longer his silence to carry alone. Across the aisle, Riley was moving through the rows again, checking on passengers, offering ginger ale, listening to polite questions and whispered speculation. A man in 6B asked her directly, "Is that really who I think it is, that guy in 2A?" Riley paused. "He's exactly who you think, and more than you know." The man blinked. "Does he own the airline?" "No," she said, "but if he wanted to, he probably could." Back in his seat, Malcolm watched the clouds through the window. Not for beauty, but for grounding. Sometimes when the world tries to blur you, you have to look outside to remember your shape. And right now, he remembered exactly who he was. The cabin had changed. Not physically. The leather seats were still warm from hours of use. The overhead bin still hummed, but the energy inside was no longer static. It moved in currents. Eyes drifted toward 2A with less suspicion now, more curiosity, more restraint, less fear, more awareness. Riley Monroe noticed the change before anyone said a word. Passengers had gone from whispering to watching. She had seen it happen before, though not often. Usually, conflict aboard a plane burned hot and fast. Someone raised their voice. Another filmed. An apology followed, and the rest of the flight slid into awkward quiet. But this was different. This wasn't noise. It was presence. Malcolm hadn't moved, and yet the entire narrative had. She found herself walking slower as she passed his row, as if the gravity around him had increased. He was still scribbling in his notebook, the pen gliding smoothly, silently. Not a single line looked like a throwaway. Every sentence he wrote seemed intended for something larger than the moment. A legacy, a warning, a blueprint. Genevieve Locke sat frozen in her seat. Her phone was in her lap now, screen off, mouth tight. The cocktail napkin on her tray was crumpled like a paper she'd tried to throw away, but didn't have the courage to release. Her breathing had changed, too. Riley could hear it when she passed. Shallow, uneven, not panic, not guilt. Something more primal. Exposure. Meanwhile, Malcolm's statement had gone live. Greer Corps' official page had posted it under the title, "A Letter from Seat 2A." The caption was quiet, simple. We believe in letting truth speak for itself. And in this case, we let our founders' words do just that. The post was already being shared by advocacy groups, CEOs, student unions, and flight attendants unions from 3 different airlines. Riley caught a glimpse on another passenger's iPad as she leaned to collect a tray. She paused for only a moment, her eyes locking on the headline. Her heart stuttered, not in fear, in recognition. She turned slightly and looked at Malcolm. There was a time she might have dismissed this man as another executive in a perfectly tailored suit. Just another private flyer slumming it in first class because his jet was under maintenance. But no. He had made a choice to sit among others, to be visible. And now that choice was echoing across the world. It hit her then, mid-aisle, with a clarity she could neither explain nor ignore. She had been trained to identify threats, de-escalate conflict, preserve the comfort of the many. But no one had ever taught her to recognize power when it was used without force. She took a shaky breath and turned toward the rear galley, hoping for a moment of quiet. She needed to breathe. Inside the small space, she leaned against the counter and gripped the edge. What am I doing? Why am I still part of this? Her mind raced through years of incidents she'd excused, jokes she let pass in crew lounges, requests she fulfilled even when they tasted wrong, and all the little silences she'd buried like bones beneath a polished uniform. She pressed a hand to her stomach. And what if she said something now? What if she told her manager mid-flight that the system was failing? That Genevieve had fabricated the entire excuse, that she had seen the note, that she had watched her fellow crew members ignore Malcolm's quiet strength until it became undeniable? Would they fire her? Would they blacklist her from an industry she had spent 12 years trying to rise within? Or worse, would they call her emotional? She stood there for several minutes, unsure of where her courage started and her job ended. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Malcolm, not intruding, just waiting. Riley stepped out into the narrow corridor between galleys. The hum of the plane was louder here. Mechanical, constant. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, not sure how much to reveal, how much of herself to risk. He didn't press. He simply stood there, still, present. And that stillness gave her something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Permission. "I should have done more," she said finally. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You didn't owe me anything," he replied gently, "but I owed it to myself." He gave the smallest nod. Then, "Maybe it's not too late." Her throat tightened. "Why are you so calm?" she asked, searching his face. "Because I've had to be," Malcolm said. "But that doesn't mean I'm not angry." She swallowed. Then, "How do you carry it? I don't. Not alone. That's why I write, why I build things, why I show up in rooms I was never meant to be in." He leaned slightly forward, voice just above a whisper, "Because the weight breaks you when you pretend it isn't there, but it becomes something else when you share it." They stood in silence, not as flight attendant and passenger, but as two people staring down the same truth from opposite ends of power. Riley stepped back toward the aisle. "Thank you," she whispered. "No need," he said. But Riley knew differently. She returned to her duties with a different energy. She moved row by row, not performing, but connecting. She made eye contact. She listened. She responded without protocol. And in doing so, she felt the shift in herself as surely as she'd felt it in the cabin. In row 9, the young man in the hoodie gave her a subtle nod as she passed. He had seen the post. She could tell. His eyes were lit not with fear anymore, but with resolve. Malcolm returned to his seat. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was from an unfamiliar contact, but the message was unmistakable. A letter from seat 2A. They're calling it the Altitude Doctrine. It's already taught me more than any boardroom memo ever did. Thank you. He closed the phone. Outside the window, the horizon stretched endlessly, a band of fire along the edge of dusk. In that moment, Malcolm didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. And sometimes, that was the greatest kind of power, the kind you didn't need to defend, just live by, somewhere over central Nebraska. The captain made a minor course adjustment to avoid turbulence. The skies outside were still calm, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere thickened with a kind of invisible electricity. Passengers who hadn't cared 2 hours ago were now on their second scroll through the same social media thread. Others were whispering about the headline quietly pinging through the onboard Wi-Fi. Altitude Doctrine, Black CEOs, Seat Refusal, Sparks Corporate Reckoning. The phrase made its way onto screens like a whisper that grew legs. By now, it was trending. Hashtags multiplied. Altitude Doctrine, Seat 2A, stellar silence, and then came the real shift. Malcolm received a secure ping from his company's internal alert system. The Stellar Atlantic Holdings Group stock had dropped 3% in under 90 minutes. No public statement had been issued yet, but insiders were already texting journalists. One read, "We warned them. He's not just any passenger." Another, "He's going to change this industry. Watch." Malcolm closed the alert. He didn't smile. He didn't frown either. But something in his eyes sharpened, the kind of focus that only comes when consequences finally start moving. Riley passed through the cabin again, this time not to serve, but to observe. She paused at row 3, pretended to adjust the overhead compartment, and allowed herself a moment to study Malcolm without being noticed. She had never seen a man so composed under such pressure. Not aloof, not cold, just centered. She found herself wondering what it would feel like to carry dignity like armor, to walk into a storm with no umbrella and still stay dry. Behind her, Genevieve Locke clicked furiously at her phone. The onboard system still limited outgoing calls, but she was crafting a statement for her lawyer to issue the moment they landed. It started with, "I felt unsafe," and included phrases like miscommunication and corporate defamation. She wasn't done trying to rewrite her role in this. Malcolm, on the other hand, wasn't rewriting anything. He was still adding to the same page of his notebook, page after page of quiet reflection and sharp clarity. Riley noticed something as she leaned to check the status of a lavatory light. Malcolm wasn't taking notes. He was writing letters, not to the public, not for release, but personal ones. "Dear Dad, I sat in the seat today, the one no one wanted me in. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I stayed, just like you taught me." She only saw a few lines before respectfully looking away, but it was enough. This wasn't a stunt. This wasn't strategy. It was repair. Personal, generational repair. And Riley suddenly realized that sometimes the strongest public acts are the most personal ones, too. The PA system chimed. The captain's voice came through, calm and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our initial descent into Chicago O'Hare within the next 20 minutes. Please secure all carry-ons and return to your seats. Weather conditions are stable, and we expect an on-time arrival. Normal words, spoken 1,000 times. But nothing about this flight was normal anymore. Back in 2A, Malcolm powered down his phone, not because he needed to, but because some things deserved to land in silence. His mind drifted to the last time he had felt truly cornered. It wasn't in business. It was personal. He had flown to Baton Rouge after receiving a call that his niece had been accused of shoplifting in a boutique she had worked at for 2 years. The accusation hadn't held. No evidence, no statement, but she had been fired anyway. He remembered the way she trembled when she saw him at the airport gate, the way her voice cracked when she said, "I didn't do anything. I just looked like someone who could have." And now, here he was again, in a different city, a different uniform, but the same undercurrent. The suspicion that came not from action, but from presence. He would never forget that feeling, and he would never let his niece live in a world that normalized it. He stared out the window. The clouds had thinned now. Below them, city lights began to emerge like scattered coins tossed across the dark earth. They were almost home. Riley stood in the front galley, watching the seatbelt light flick on. She ran her hands over her uniform, adjusting seams that didn't need adjusting. Her nerves hummed in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not quite. Resolve. She turned to her colleague, a senior flight attendant named Heather, who had remained mostly silent the entire flight. "I'm logging this," Riley said quietly. Heather looked up from her seat. "Are you sure?" "Yes. The company won't like it." "I know." Heather hesitated, then nodded. "Then make sure your report matches your heart, not just the handbook." That surprised Riley. It was the first time Heather had said anything remotely personal during their shift together, but it gave Riley the courage to act. She tapped her employee tablet, opened the internal reporting form, and began to type. Incident involving premium passenger in 2A. Requested to vacate seat by passenger in 2B using fabricated excuse. Flight crew failed to intervene until situation escalated via external exposure. Recommend internal review of seat reassignment policies and bias training. Passenger in 2A remained calm and cooperative throughout. She didn't include Malcolm's name. She didn't have to. They would know. She hit send, and, for the first time in years, she felt like her uniform finally fit the person she was trying to be. As the plane began its final descent, a hush fell over the cabin. The man in 4D, who had been filming, slowly put his phone away. The girl in 5F, who had been tweeting live updates, closed her screen and glanced once more at Malcolm with something like gratitude. Even Genevieve was quiet now. Not defeated, but diminished. The weight of being seen settling into her posture like cold air. As the plane touched down, wheels kissing the runway in a smooth arc. Malcolm exhaled. He didn't celebrate. He didn't shift. He had never left his seat. The moment the aircraft came to a full stop at gate 37B, the energy in the cabin shifted again. Not relief, not routine. Something else. A held breath finally let go. The seatbelt signs went off with a soft chime. Dozens of clicks followed in chorus as passengers unlatched their belts, but no one moved as quickly as they usually did. There was a hesitancy, as if they all knew they had just been part of something larger than a typical flight, something that didn't end just because the wheels stopped moving. Riley Monroe stood near the forward exit, her posture tall, hands gently clasped in front of her. Her eyes scanned the jet bridge through the small porthole window on the door. She could already see 2 airline officials waiting outside, clipboards in hand, tension in their shoulders. They had been briefed. She turned toward Malcolm Greer, who remained seated in 2A, perfectly still, watching everyone with a calm that disarmed more than it intimidated. Genevieve Locke, still in 2B, gathered her bag with stiff movements, the way someone does when they realize the eyes of 100 strangers are no longer on their side. Malcolm stood only when it was time. He collected his leather satchel, checked that his notebook was tucked away, and gave Riley a soft nod as he stepped toward the front. She met his gaze. "Steady. They're waiting for you," she said quietly. "I know. Do you want assistance? Not unless it comes with honesty." That made Riley blink. Then smile. "Then you've already got it." Malcolm stepped off the aircraft as if he had never been removed from his seat, as if he had never needed permission to belong. His shoes tapped calmly against the jet bridge floor. The waiting officials flanked him within seconds. "Mr. Greer," one of them began. "We're here to escort you to a secure lounge. There's a company representative who would like to speak with you." "Privately?" Malcolm raised a brow slightly. "And why would I need a private room for a very public incident?" The man in the gray blazer hesitated. "Sir, we are just following protocol. That would be the same protocol that permitted a fabricated safety report to displace a ticketed passenger." The man didn't respond. Malcolm smiled with no warmth. "Then, let's be clear. I will walk through this terminal. I will not be hidden. And I will not be escorted into silence. But you are welcome to walk with me." He turned before they could argue, walking into the terminal at full height. People were already filming. Passengers from Flight 2087 had exited behind him. Some shook his hand as they passed. Some simply looked him in the eye and gave a respectful nod. A young woman in a green hoodie mouthed "thank you" before disappearing into the crowd. Genevieve tried to walk past unnoticed, but one of the camera phones caught her clearly. The internet would know by morning who she was. The freeze frame of her whispering to a flight attendant, the smug curl of her lip in row 2B, and the shock in her face when she realized the seat had belonged to someone she could not quietly erase. By the time Malcolm reached the terminal's central atrium, reporters had already arrived. A local NBC affiliate shoved a mic toward him. "Mr. Greer, is it true you were forcibly removed from your first-class seat due to racial profiling?" Malcolm stopped walking. He did not dodge. He did not defer. "I was not forcibly removed. I was invited to step aside in a manner that was polite in tone and systemic in nature. It's the kind of invitation that's hard to refuse because it's dressed in civility but built on a structure of bias." What do you want the airline to do? Change. Not just apologize, not just train staff. I want them to change who they serve and how. And more than that, I want them to stop pretending this is isolated. Are you pursuing legal action? I'm pursuing clarity. Legal action is one tool. So is truth. The mic dropped slightly. Riley watched the entire exchange from the gate's glass windows. She felt her chest tighten and her eyes sting. Not from sadness, from resonance. He had said what so many felt but didn't have the words or power to voice. Another woman stood nearby, arms crossed tightly. Her name tag read Nadine. She had been scheduled as ground crew, but had quietly swapped shifts after hearing about the incident. Now she watched this unfold with her own memories swirling behind her eyes. She remembered a time when her son had been stopped at the gate because his boarding pass didn't scan properly. He was 10. It had left him terrified to fly again. And now she was watching a man speak truth in a way that gave her son's pain context. Security approached, but didn't interfere. Their radios buzzed, but their postures remained neutral. No one wanted to be the one on camera, removing a calm black executive mid-statement. By the time Malcolm reached baggage claim, a small crowd had formed. Not a mob, not chaos. Just people. Listening, recording, remembering. A college student in a journalism hoodie walked up slowly. "Sir," she asked gently, "what keeps you so steady?" Malcolm paused. "I've known turbulence," he said, "but I've also known what it feels like to land safely. And I've learned that it's not the wind that breaks you. It's pretending the shaking means nothing." She nodded. Her recorder caught it all. He exited the terminal without needing protection, just presence. Outside, a car waited. His driver didn't speak at first. He just opened the door and gave him a small nod. But as Malcolm slid into the back seat, the driver turned. "Sir, my nephew was on your flight. He said you taught him something without yelling. Thank you." Malcolm nodded. "Tell him to keep watching. The work's not done yet." As the car pulled away from the curb, the airport behind him buzzed with new energy. Not because of outrage, because of accountability. And Malcolm Greer was no longer just a CEO. He was a measure of calm, of confrontation, of what it means to reclaim the seat no one ever had the right to take. 3 days after Flight 2087 landed, Stellar Atlantic Holdings convened an emergency board meeting in its downtown Manhattan headquarters. The conference room was perched high above the city skyline, glass walls, marble table, leather chairs that whispered wealth every time someone shifted their weight. But today, those whispers gave way to silence. At the head of the table sat Meredith Langdon, interim chairwoman, her tablet glowing with reports from legal, HR, PR, and investor relations. She had 3 decades in the industry, known for keeping her cool even when the market didn't. But today, she looked like someone searching for oxygen in a room full of fog. The numbers weren't good. Stock had dropped another 5% since the incident. 4 major corporate clients had canceled bulk travel accounts. And most alarmingly, 2 board members had received private letters from shareholders demanding accountability. At the center of the storm, Malcolm Greer. He had not made any legal threats. He had not spoken to media beyond a brief public statement. And yet, his silence had thundered louder than any press conference. Langdon cleared her throat and cleared her. "We need to discuss the operational review," she said, eyes sweeping the room. Several executives glanced down at their notes. One of them, a vice president named Curtis Maddox, leaned forward. "We're compiling a list of procedural errors on the flight. The flight crew failed to adhere to the seating protocol once the passenger had boarded. The reassignment was unauthorized. But technically, Ms. Locke's note wasn't documented in the system, so Langdon held up a hand. "Curtis, this is not about procedural gaps. This is about perception. The entire nation saw a black executive displaced from a first-class seat without raising his voice. And our company looked indifferent. Our silence looked strategic." She paused, letting her words settle. It wasn't just an error. It became a symbol. Another voice joined in. Peter Vaughn, head of global partnerships. "I know Malcolm. We sat on the same advisory board in D.C. for 2 years. He's not a man who chases headlines. If he stayed quiet, it was deliberate. He knew silence would say more than 1,000 interviews." Langdon turned to him. "And what do you suggest we do now?" Peter took a breath. He already made his move. Now it's our turn. Either we reform internally or we wait for him to do it for us from the outside. The room quieted. No one liked the second option. Meanwhile, in a brownstone in Harlem, Malcolm Greer was having coffee with his mother. She was a retired librarian, small-framed, warm eyes, and the kind of sharp memory that remembered every library card number she ever issued. She handed him a plate of toast. "So, You shook up the skies, she said casually. He smiled. That wasn't the plan. She sat across from him. Then what was to stay in my seat? Her eyes narrowed with affection. You stayed in your seat and made the ground move. That's more than civil disobedience. That's seismic. Malcolm looked out the window. I just didn't want it to happen again. Not to me. Not to someone's child. Not while I had a voice. His mother studied him. You've always had a voice. You just decided to stop using it for peace and start using it for presence. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Riley Monroe. Just wanted you to know, they're auditing bias complaints now. Quietly. But it's a start. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak up. Malcolm stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Thank you for listening before the world did. Back at Stellar Atlantic headquarters, Langdon finalized a decision. The company would issue a formal public apology, not a corporate template. A full-page statement signed by every board member, acknowledging the systemic failure, the embedded biases, and the need for internal cultural realignment. They would also invite Malcolm Greer to consult on the creation of a new oversight board, a civilian-led council to review racial and socioeconomic complaints related to flight experience. It was bold, unprecedented, and exactly what shareholders were beginning to demand. At 2:07 p.m. Eastern, the company issued its statement. We failed a passenger whose only disruption was presence. We failed our staff by not equipping them with the tools to confront bias. We failed our values. And we are changing, not because of fear, but because of clarity. We owe Mr. Malcolm Greer and every passenger watching this moment a better path forward. It went viral within minutes, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. By evening, 3 additional airlines had announced they were reviewing their seat reassignment protocols. 2 aviation trade journals ran editorials calling Malcolm Greer's stand one of the most dignified protest statements in modern corporate history. And still, Malcolm did not speak publicly again. He was in his garden, watering rosemary and basil. His niece sat beside him, cross-legged, reading aloud from her college application essay. It started with the line, "My uncle didn't tell me to rise. He showed me how to stay seated and still take flight." Malcolm closed his eyes and let the words settle in the summer air. The change he wanted was not theoretical anymore. It was happening, slowly, widely, and in the right direction. Malcolm Greer had never seen his name trend globally before. It was surreal. By the time Monday arrived, he had received over 4,000 emails. Some were from strangers, others from former students, CEOs, pilots, parents, even kids. The subject lines blurred together. Thank you for standing still. You gave me words I didn't know I needed. My daughter watched. She saw dignity. He read every single one, but he didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, he brewed coffee in silence, letting the aroma settle into the quiet corners of his townhouse. The sunlight angled through the kitchen window in sharp lines. His garden waited just beyond the glass. He had spent years building a sanctuary there, a place where he could listen to birds and not boardrooms. But that world was changing now. An envelope sat unopened on the edge of the counter. He already knew what was inside. An official offer from Stellar Atlantic's executive committee. They wanted him to serve as chair of a newly formed Passenger Equity Council, an independent civilian-led oversight board. The role would be public, transparent, and powerful. They were offering more than a title. They were offering him the front seat in a new kind of plane, but Malcolm felt a hesitation that wouldn't leave his chest. He took his mug and walked outside to the garden. The air was cool for June. He sat on the bench under the fig tree and stared at the unopened letter again. From the street, he could hear city life move on. Horns, laughter, footsteps on concrete. It all kept going, with or without him. His phone buzzed. Another message. This one from Riley Monroe. I know you probably don't need more opinions right now, but if you do say yes, just know that some of us will be standing with you, even the ones they never let speak. Malcolm stared at the screen. Even the ones they never let speak. He remembered her face on the plane. Not panicked, not loud, just clear. She had taken a risk too. He had not forgotten. That evening, he agreed to meet with the executive team not in a boardroom, but at a community center in Harlem on 145th Street, near where he grew up. If they wanted him, they could come where his roots were. Langdon arrived first, dressed in muted gray. No entourage, no press, just herself and a thin leather portfolio. She found Malcolm already seated in the circle of folding chairs inside the center's library. Children's books lined the walls. A handmade quilt of black aviators in American history hung behind them. Malcolm stood and shook her hand. No cameras, she said, just policy. He nodded. We want you to lead this council, she began. Not just because of what happened, but because you understand the space between experience and change. That space is where most systems fail. You've lived it, and people trust you. Malcolm studied her face. It held weariness, and something else. Fear. You know the board is not ready for this, don't you? He asked. She didn't flinch. They're not, but that's never stopped change before. He leaned back slightly in his chair. And what happens when the public loses patience? Langdon gave a tired smile. Then we show them that dignity doesn't expire with outrage. It deepens. Malcolm went quiet. He looked around the room. There were scratches on the floors, frayed carpet near the edges. A photo of Bayard Rustin and Rosa Parks hung near the entrance. They had not asked for spotlights either. What you are asking me to do, Malcolm said, is not just lead reform. You're asking me to become a symbol. Langdon met his gaze. I am asking you to stay visible. Those words landed with weight. He remembered a time when his father had refused to ride a bus after being called a slur. Not because he was angry, but because he was tired. Tired of being seen only when silence broke. Tired of carrying a flag no one else wanted to hold. Malcolm had sworn he would live differently. Quietly, carefully, productively. And yet, here he was, public again. They left the center without a final answer. Langdon respected the space he needed. That night, Malcolm couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, listening to the rustle of wind in the leaves. The city was quieter now, but his mind was not. What if he accepted the role and failed? What if his presence gave the airline a free pass to delay real change? What if he became just another name used for press releases, but then another voice entered the storm? His own. What if he didn't step in? What if the next boy, 15 years old, dressed neat for a school trip, got bumped off a flight because someone didn't think he belonged? What if that boy never learned to speak because no one showed him how? By dawn, Malcolm had made his decision. He sat at his desk and opened the envelope. He signed the acceptance letter with a steady hand, but he made one amendment. He requested that the council include 10 members from community organizations, none of whom held government or corporate titles. He wanted real eyes in the room, not just reflections of boardrooms. When the news broke that he had accepted the role, social media lit up again, but Malcolm did not give interviews. He gave direction. The first meeting of the Passenger Equity Council was scheduled for July 3rd. He chose that date deliberately. A reminder of independence, but this time, it would not be for a country. It would be for the skies. The auditorium wasn't large. It seated maybe 200 people. Folded chairs, soft lighting, an overhead projector that flickered once when turned on, but every seat was taken. The first session of the Passenger Equity Council had begun. July 3rd, a date chosen with care. Malcolm Greer stood at the front, not behind a podium, just beside a long table with a chipped edge and a few paper name placards. He wore a navy blue blazer, no tie. His hands rested gently against each other as he spoke. Before anything else, thank you for showing up. The crowd was silent, listening, not just to his words, but to the way he carried them. He continued, "This isn't a launch. It's a response. A response to something that should never have needed correcting. A simple seat, a simple silence. But the weight of it revealed everything hiding beneath the surface." He glanced toward the front row where Riley Monroe sat. She gave a quiet nod. A few seats down sat his mother. Her eyes glistened but did not waver. "To those who think this is about politics," Malcolm said, "it's not. This is about presence, about the right to exist in a space without being viewed as suspicious or out of place. That's not a favor. That's humanity." He paused. "Let's begin." The council wasn't decorative. It held real authority. They would review flight reports of discrimination, audit staffing diversity across routes, require regular unconscious bias training, and issue public quarterly reports. Malcolm's one non-negotiable that their budget be independent of the airline's profit centers. He didn't want justice tied to how many business-class seats were sold. Over the next 6 months, something rare happened. The aviation industry, usually resistant to rapid change, began to shift. Other airlines, not wanting to fall behind, implemented similar oversight boards. By December, 3 national carriers had adopted the Malcolm Protocol, a written policy that prohibited reassignment of any seated passenger unless accompanied by managerial approval, documented cause, and body cam confirmation. Some called it overcorrection. Others called it overdue. But for the people in rows 2A and 14C and 27D, it felt like breath, like safety, like finally being seen. One afternoon, Malcolm returned to the airport not as a speaker, but as a traveler. He had a lecture to give in Houston. Nothing political, just business leadership to a group of first-year MBA students. As he approached Gate 9, a flight attendant noticed him. A younger woman. Nervous smile. She glanced at the boarding screen, then back at him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Greer. Your seat has been confirmed." He smiled softly. "Thank you. I'm just a passenger today." She nodded, but her voice trembled a little. "Sir, I wanted to say thank you. My cousin was removed from a flight once. Nothing official, just told the seat needed rebalancing." He didn't argue, but I remember how small he looked walking back to the last row. He didn't speak for a week after. "But after what you did, he applied to become a pilot." Malcolm didn't speak at first. Then he simply said, "Tell him to fly far." He boarded. No eyes lingered too long. No notes on his seat. Just the steady hum of passengers settling into a rhythm of shared air. He sat in 2A again. But this time, it wasn't about reclaiming anything. It was about witnessing change. 30 minutes into the flight, the captain's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, I usually don't make special announcements, but today we have someone on board who quietly shifted an entire industry." He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stayed seated and showed us how to rise. "On behalf of our crew, thank you, Mr. Greer." The cabin broke into soft applause. Malcolm lowered his head, hands folded again. He had never liked praise, but this felt different. Not applause for him, but for a moment that reminded people they mattered. When the flight landed, he let others exit first. He liked watching people reclaim their pace without rush. Outside the terminal, a boy about 10 years old tugged at his mother's hand. That's him. That's the man from the video. Malcolm smiled. The mother gave a warm nod. The boy stepped forward. Did it feel scary? Yes, Malcolm answered, but it felt right. The boy thought for a moment. I want to be like that when I grow up. Malcolm knelt to his level. No need to wait until you grow up. You just need to know what seat is yours, and not move unless you choose to. The boy looked confused for a moment, then smiled. Okay. The mother whispered a thank you as they walked away. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Malcolm returned to his townhouse. The garden was quiet. The fig tree had grown new leaves. He sat outside as the sky turned violet. His niece had left a letter on his table. She'd been accepted into Howard. Full scholarship. She had chosen aviation economics as her major. Her essay had opened with the same words she once read aloud. My uncle didn't tell me to rise. He showed me how to stay seated and still take flight. Malcolm folded the letter gently. In the sky above him, a plane passed, silver and clean. And for the first time in years, he looked at it not with dread, but with pride, because change had flown further than he ever thought possible. Not through anger, not through shouts, but through stillness, through presence, through the quiet refusal to disappear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten lawsuits. He just stayed seated. And in doing so, Malcolm Greer changed everything, not just for himself, but for millions of passengers who've ever been told you don't belong here. In the months that followed, policy changed. Oversight was enforced, and dignity finally got a seat on the plane. But beyond the headlines, beyond the council meetings, one truth echoed the loudest. Every act of quiet courage plants a seed for someone else's freedom. And yet, why did it take a viral moment to reveal what so many have been quietly enduring for years? Why do we still live in a world where the color of your skin can decide the quality of your seat? This story is not just a victory. It is a call to pay attention, a call to speak up, a call to never let respect become a luxury. To all who have felt unseen, unheard, unseated, we see you, and your seat is still yours. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice helps stories like these travel further. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because next time, the seat in question might be yours. We'll be here telling the stories that matter. Until then, take care and stay grounded.